Well, folks, we're back with another Festival of Legends card review, and we've got a bunch of Warrior cards. Is Warrior saved based on these latest reveals? I don't think so, unfortunately. We'll talk about it here in a second. We've also got some priest cards, including, I think, a pretty crazy legendary spell, and maybe a new archetype for Mage to talk about as well. But let's kick it off here with Rock Master Voon. This is a callback to the old, I think it was War Master Voon. Same stats and cost here as a 4-mana 4/3, and pretty much the same battle cry. And this copies a minion of each minion type in your hand, as opposed to the old one, which would copy your dragons. So this is setting up a menagerie archetype for Warrior, it looks like. And we've got a few other cards that are both minion typed that might fit in here nicely, but also some stuff that straight up supports menagerie play, like this will draw cards, getting extra for each minion type you have. And this will actually get bigger based on all the minion types you've played this game. So some kind of minion menagerie deck is coming together here. And, you know, it's got a mix of stuff. If you're actually running the Razorfin Rockstar in this list, this is very defensive. This is kind of reactive as a rush minion, but also it's about big stats. Then we got a new dragon here as well, which, I don't know if this all necessarily goes together, but some kind of like rush menagerie game plan is developing, it looks like, based on these cards that they all revealed together. Now that said, for Rockmaster Voon here, this is purely just a value generator. This is not, this is a big tempo sacrifice, right? You don't want to play a 4-mana 4/3. You're really not doing much on board there, just getting some really weak stats. And we actually saw this with the old Voon. Sometimes it just felt really awkward to play this card, because what would happen is you just get a big old pile of stuff in hand, and it's really hard to play that stuff. It doesn't often offer that much recovery. Even if you look at the rush minions here, right? These are cards that are attacking like singular targets, for instance. There's no way to sweep up a board with these sorts of cards after you've kind of sacrificed a little tempo. Are you getting it back effectively, even with multiple copies of all of these? Eventually, yes, a couple power sliders in one turn would be pretty cool, but notice these aren't actually getting copied, so you have to have these just organically. Drum Soloists, pretty expensive to use as a recovery card. Taunt and Rush helps. It can be both take a trade and set up defensively, but I don't know, it still doesn't look all that efficient to me. Cheap cards like this one, like the Razorfin Rockstar, these help more. The cheaper the card, the faster you can kind of put all that extra value into play off the Rockmaster Voon. So I think the question we have to ask is, are there like enough cheap menagerie cards that support a specific game plan that feels good? And if you look through Warrior minions here real quickly, and this won't be perfect because some of these are going to be rotating, but Warrior class minions in particular, I don't know, man, not that much stands out at me. There's some like cheap pirates, right? We got some cheap pirates here. There's a cheap mech pirate here with a hook fist. This isn't too bad. My head's kind of covering that, I realize. This guy from the mini set, like, yeah, that's okay. It's a good like elemental beast here. It's kind of defensive and control-y, but already trending a little expensive for this sort of game plan, I think. Thor Balor is an elemental beast. Okay, it's kind of cool. Same combo, but that's not bad, I guess, right? But it's already getting in that 4-mana range, and then that's it. And there's some really expensive stuff up here too, but really not a lot of units that stand out. Now, of course, you can go to neutral cards too, but keep in mind, of course, neutral cards tend to have a little bit lower power per card output than class cards, so those aren't usually ideal. But there's some stuff like Annoying Fan, and there's of course the Mistake, the new amalgam guy. So there are cheap cards that probably contribute to this, but are they actually developing a game plan? In other words, is it going to be an aggro deck? I don't think so. Rockmaster Voon doesn't really play towards aggro very well, since this is just a value generator. And all the cheap stuff that you probably want to copy that's really effective to help you catch up, that might be stuff you're playing before Rockmaster Voon. Is it stuff you had to play out to keep up tempo if you're trying to play for a faster deck, and then Voon himself is a huge sacrifice in those sorts of decks, because you're giving up a pretty effective 4-mana here that doesn't really contribute much to board. So are you playing a control deck in that case? Well, does control really want a bunch of extra minions, especially if they don't have some sort of great reactive utility? that becomes a shaky proposition as well. You might want a lot more spells and reactive sorts of cards than Voon can offer. So at the end of the day, I look at this and I go, okay, man, this model's a card that wasn't all that successful back in the day. It's really value focused. Is that actually going to fit into Hearthstone's metas? And what cards are you really trying to copy here that feel best? Those are all questions that are, I think, pretty hard to answer for me right now. Now, it could very well be true that this card's not supposed to be good right now, and this is setting up for the future. Like, oh, we're going to get some awesome extra Menagerie cards in sets 2 and 3 this year, and then Rockmaster Voon's going to come along, and the pieces will all still fit together. I think that's a possibility for this card, but I have to say that feels pretty disappointing right now, when I think a lot of people probably want Warrior to feel good because we've seen so many presumably weak Warrior cards so far. A lot of frustration out there that Warrior is dead and so on. Perhaps a little exaggerated, but I think certainly reasonable feelings. And I don't think this changes course at all for Warrior. This to me again feels like a pretty underwhelming card right now. So next up, the Razorfin Rockstar. This is the card I think actually is the most interesting to me in this Warrior package. Not necessarily even as a Menagerie support card, but just as a really cheap armor support card. And you know, we know that Control Warrior historically has liked armor. I don't actually think Control Warrior looks like it's going to be very good right now, but this is one of those cards I think you put in your back pocket and you say, yeah, this actually sounds like it's going to be pretty valuable down the road. Now, notably, I'm told these are not recursive, just to get this out of the way early. So if you have 2 of these on board, they don't just infinitely loop each other. There's a check in place so that they just like loop the one kind of time and don't just start bouncing back and forth or whatever. So I think the first one will hit the second one. In other words, like if the Razorfin Rockstar goes off, I think the second one will go off in response to the Razorfin Rockstar. I'm not 100% sure. I expect it to happen, but then they won't just pass back and forth forever, if that makes sense. But anyway, this is just kind of a cheap way to get an extra little armor boost. You kind of expect to gain at least 2 armor here off the Razorfin Rockstar, because if you're playing it, you're probably gaining armor in some other way. But also, you know, any other stack of armor cards you play, or any kind of thing that's like multiple ticks of armor all at once, I think the Rockstar would really start to increment that pretty heavily. This might be a card that nets you like 6 or 8 additional health, and you're not sacrificing much because you're just getting a nice little 1 mana 1/3. So is this a card you play in 1? No, not necessarily. Is this a card you weave into turns in the mid game or something? That's where I think this one really does start to thrive. And yeah, if there is a good Menagerie deck, I'm sure the Rockstar will fit in nicely, but I think this card actually escapes that archetype. It just becomes a valuable way to get a bunch of extra life out of this. So next up here, we have the Roaring Applause. This is a new 2-mana spell. It draws a card, and then it repeats for each minion type you control. So of course, if you do have a Menagerie build with a bunch of different minion types, then yeah, this could be some great, really efficient card draw. Keep in mind for things that are multi-typed or like an amalgam, this isn't going to go off like 10 times because you have 1 amalgam on board. It'll count each minion individually, so you know, amalgam is not just 3 mana draw 10 or whatever the number is, right? That would be a little silly, but still, I mean, just having like 2 minions on board makes this pretty efficient, like crazy efficient. 2 mana draw 3 would be insane just to have 2 different minion type minions on board. So yes, if you have a Menagerie deck with 3 or 4 minions, this is hyper crazy efficient card draw, which is great. But I don't think it needs to be, actually. I think having 1 minion type on board makes Roaring Applause reasonable. That's a 2 mana draw 2, which means this doesn't actually necessarily need a Menagerie deck to work well. It just needs a deck that's running any kind of minion type card. And of course, that's gonna happen. That'll just incidentally be in your deck very often. And you'll have turns where this is a 2 mana draw 2, which looks efficient. And you'll have some moments that line up if the deck is built for it, especially that this is 2 mana draw 3, 2 mana draw 4, and so on, where it becomes a really crazy powerful card. So I actually, interestingly, like both of these cards a lot more than I like Rockmaster Voon. I think these feel much, much better and have some independence in particular, which is nice, but they may be a little bit hamstrung by their connection to this, I think, doubtful archetype, I'll say, with Menagerie. So next up here, we have the Power Slider, and this card looks awesome, by the way. 3 mana 1/2 with Rush. Battlecry, gain +1/+1 for each minion type you've played this game. So this game is certainly going to help this get up there, but do keep in mind it sounds like these have to be distinct minion types. So for instance, if you play 4 mechs, that's not a +4/+4 buff. It's not minions with minion types, it's minion types. So you really have to put this in a menagerie deck. And of course, you're not going to be excited to play this on turn 3 because you won't have had time to play enough minion types. You'd probably have 2 if things went perfectly. That would give this a +2/+2 buff, which is not great. It's a 3 mana 3/4 with rush. Like, that's not exciting yet. So I think you really have to get this up into that like +4, +5 range to feel like it's a really exciting card. But then this is coming down, I think, fairly late in the game. You know, maybe turn 5 is where this starts to look interesting. Turn 6, turn 7, where you've had enough time to consistently get minion types in play. And then, you know, it is a fairly large rush minion interesting on turn 6 or 7, you know? It's not even going to be that much bigger than like Wild Paw Knolls that were coming down on like turn 2 or whatever. It's like, oh yeah, okay, man, I got like a 6/7 rusher for 3. That's of course efficient in a vacuum, but you have to think about game state, reliability. It's sitting dead in hand. It's got this context problem. All of those are checks in place that seem like they really limit the consistency of this card and the playability of this card, especially early in the game when you care most about like reactive rushing sorts of stats. So man, the conditionality check here just seems really hard for me on Power Slider. I think that's going to hold this card back a lot. Again, I like some of these menagerie cards, but some of the like payoffs or whatever with, I mean, Voon is kind of a payoff, kind of a setup. You know what I mean? Like the big reasons to do this perhaps don't actually feel all that good. You might argue Roaring Applause is a reason to do this, but again, if you're just drawing extra bad cards, it's not necessarily great card draw. So I like these two independently. I don't much love Power Slider or Voon in this case. So next up here we have the Drum Soloist, and in a lot of ways it's kind of like our last card. 5 mana 5/5 dragon. It's got Taunt and Battle Cry. If you control no other minions, gain +2/+2 and rush. And that's what I mean here by kind of like our last card, because this is going to be a card that comes down in the mid to late game, and it's just a big old pile of rushing stats. The Taunt here I think does help, because sometimes if you just have one big rusher and it trades into a small wider board, it's just kind of sitting there and your opponent's just running 3 or 4 minions to face because one thing didn't deal with their 3 or 4 things. The Taunt helps to give you a little bit of defensive backup so that if they have like 3 3/3s or something, this can still maybe interact with their board in some ways. That said, you know, ultimately this is again just a pile of stats in the mid game, which tend to lose efficacy as a game goes on. Like, stats just matter less and less the longer a game persists. And I don't know, this is 5 is kind of that sweet spot where maybe that's big enough to be there, but I hate that it's like all in on a single play. It has this conditionality with the lack of other minions, so there's going to be some awkward moments and some big mana commitments for this one to make it sometimes very punishing to play, where it's like, oh man, I got to spend 5 mana on this guy, which doesn't leave me a lot of room to do other things with my turn, and doesn't feel like a really reactive or efficient way to play for 5 mana very often. So I still have some hesitations here with the Drum Soloist, and a large part of this kind of menagerie package. I don't think this card has to be a menagerie card necessarily, but I don't think you have any reason to run it otherwise. So let's move on. We've been dumping on Warrior a little bit. Let's move over to Priest. I think this card's actually really strong. This is Love Everlasting, the legendary spell for Priest. It's a 3 mana holy spell, and it reads, your first spell each turn costs 2 less, lasts until you don't play a spell on your turn. So keep in mind that the turn you play this, it will be your first spell. So there's no discount immediate on this. You are kind of spending that 3 mana the first turn you play this. But then moving forward each turn throughout the game, as long as you're playing spells to keep this alive, as long as it's everlasting via your spells, then you're getting this 2 mana discount at the start of each turn on a spell. So it's kind of like having a free prep every single turn for the rest of the game. And I think for Priest in particular, it will not be difficult to maintain the Love Everlasting. There might be a turn here and there where you have to do something a little weird just to keep this rolling, but I think in most cases you're going to be it's going to be feasible to keep Love Everlasting going. In particular, we've seen things like Sister Svolna that actually just literally give you that 3-mana spell in hand every single turn, so you can just play that every turn. Might be a little hard to get a Svolna going alongside this, but not impossible by any means. But Priest just generates spells, has a lot of cheap spells to work with and roll through, so I think the achievability factor here will not really be a limiter for Love Everlasting. And in that case, what that means is all of this crazy mana cheat is possible every single turn. So you're spending 3, but it only takes 2 turns to net that back. You're gonna have 4 mana saved within 2 turns, and then it just starts to stack up over the course of the game like crazy. And Priest is a class that can typically waste a little mana early to set up for later because they have so many great recovery tools through both board clears and life gains. They can sacrifice 3 and still pull that back later in regards to that tempo gain off this spell. And in particular, this allows you to do 2 things, right? Just save mana every turn, of course, cheat out more stuff than you would normally be able to, but also sometimes just cheat out spells faster. For instance, Priest has historically had a lot of great 6-mana board clears and still have some like 5 and 6 mana board clears that are going to be able to be played a turn sooner if you play Love Everlasting on curve on 3. So I think there'll be a lot of scenarios where they play this on 3 and then they're just playing really big board clears and stabilize super hard, super fast, because Love Everlasting let them cheat some bigger cards into play, playing them sooner than would otherwise be allowed. So I think that's going to be awesome. And then just the repetitive discounts on this over time are really going to stack up to help the Priest net even more advantages and stabilization. So for me, this looks great. It is a one-of, so sometimes you won't hit this, but I don't think that's a weakness so much, right? The Priest deck will still be playing as expected normally. It's just when you do hit this, you're going to get this crazy power spike that makes your deck much, much better. So all in all, this just looks like a really efficient mana cheat card to me that also lets you do some really fun broken stuff sometimes, I'm sure. So really good card. So next up here for Priest, we have Shadow Chord Distort. This is a new 3-mana spell. Shadow, of course, give a minion -5/-5. If it has 0 attack, destroy it. And of course, if it has 0 health too, it will obviously be destroyed. And this is cool because it lets Priest answer kind of a different shape of minions. Right now we have cards like Light It Burns, which really efficiently answer either symmetrical minions or attack biased minions with, so 5/5s or 5/2s or whatever will all go away with Light It Burns, but like 5/10? No, 5/10 doesn't go away with Light It Burns. A 5/10 does go away with Shadow Chord Distort, or perhaps a more classic example is like a 4/12, one of the dragon stats. Priests used to couldn't answer 4 attack minions. Now they can. This actually works great because it gives them 0 attack, or -1 in this case, but either way, that will functionally read as 0 in Hearthstone, of course, and the minion will die, and gives Priest a different answer. So, this is one of those cards that is probably pretty meta dependent, depending on the kind of shape of threats that tend to show up in the meta a lot. If a lot of 4/12s and dragons start popping up or something, maybe Shadow Chord Distort gets added. If not, if the meta is all 3/3s and 5/5s and stuff, you might not need this card. It'd still be fine against those kinds of minions, so maybe 1 or 2 of these still pop into a deck here and there for Control Priest, but there might be more efficient options instead that handle that kind of meta more readily. So this is one of those cards like, maybe it's a one-of, maybe it's just in different lists but not in others, depending on preferences or pocket metas and so on, but seems to have certainly some degree of utility and efficiency that I'm sure will get played here and there. So finally for Priest here, we have Fight Over Me. This is a 4-mana shadow spell. This allows you to choose 2 enemy minions that would use the multi-targeting we have in Hearthstone now. They fight. Add copies of any that die to your hand. So this is a mix of both removal and value generation. You're both getting these cards and also hopefully removing some stuff along the way. Do note this is enemy minions, so you can't do cheesy stuff on your own minions with this, creating extra copies of cool things. So this is kind of like a Hysteria of old, but I think a little bit worse at removal than Hysteria, or actually probably notably worse at removal than Hysteria, because Hysteria was always great because you could pick one big thing and have it wipe out an entire board of smaller things, which sometimes would prove really efficient. This is always limiting you to 2 minions. So depending on the shape of the minions available on board, this may not even always serve as a board clear. You need things that are actually killing each other to make this feel worth it. But then also, for Priest, do you actually even care about getting your opponent's minions that often? Like, yeah, sometimes there's great stuff like Astalors or something that you're happy to copy, but a lot of time it's just going to be little junk fodder that you need to remove. And if anything, for Control Priest, I feel like sometimes hand size is actually of more value than just extra garbage resources that they don't really want to spend mana on. So in other words, I don't really think the resource generation here, the value generation of this card really adds all that much interest to it. I don't think most of the time you're going to care much about the value generation. You're going to care about efficient removal, and I don't think this proves to be as efficient as other types of removal for priests. So I think this kind of falls in a weird gap where it's doing things you don't really care about it doing at the cost of some removal efficiency that you might rather have instead. So in other words, I think there's nothing like inherently wrong with this card. It looks fine, but that's probably not good enough to make the cut, and this probably gets looked over in favor of other more efficient removal cards that do exactly what you want them to do, as opposed to this kind of mix of both worlds. All right, so next up, let's head over to Mage with this new card, Light Show. This, I think, kind of sets up like a new potential archetype, certainly a little package reveal here. This is a card that's 3-mana arcane spell. It'll shoot 2 beams at enemies that deal 2 damage. So this is kind of like a medium arcane missiles. Arcane missiles dealt 1, greater arcane missiles dealt 3, and this is going to deal 2. And it's going to shoot 1 more of these beams for each light show you've cast this game. And that means it scales up over time as you get more and more of them. And we're going to see some ways to generate potentially extra light shows. We've already got some like Savara. And then also keep in mind, there might be some big payoffs for this with like Vexilus that recasts arcane spells. And then Romath as well. If you generate a bunch of extra copies, Romath could be sending a bunch of light shows to face. Also note how this actually scales up with spell damage. Spell damage will affect the numerical value deal 2. So if you have like +2 spell damage, that'll push each beam to 4. And that means you're kind of doubling up on the base light show already for spell damage, because that's hitting for 2 beams. So if you think about it, like with spell damage, a normal card might get like +2 damage. This might get like +8 or +10 damage from spell damage because of all the repeating beams being affected by it. So there's some really interesting ways to scale this card up over time. And you know, it can hit both minions and face, so depending on the board states, it's not always going to be clean, and especially the numerical values here, since it's hitting for 2, it doesn't have the granularity of like a 1 damage ping, so 3 health or any odd numbered health minion, for instance, could really start to limit your light show's effectiveness as you're kind of wasting damage or leaving stuff up with 1 health or whatever. So, you know, while spinning this up, I think you're going to have a lot of awkwardness, and it's going to feel pretty weak for a while, because at a base level, you know, it's like a much worse Fel Barrage or something, and it probably takes 2, 3, 4 of these before you really get interested in the light show, and it feels like an efficient play. And then of course you also are spending a bunch of mana to actually wind all of this up. Like, you got to spend mana to get all these extra copies and stuff. So there's basically a lot of work and time and mana expenditure that has to go into it to make the light shows good. And then I worry by the time you get them to a point where they feel really effective, or you have the big Vexilus or Romath payoff or whatever direction it ends up going, has it been too late? Did you spend too much time and mana wasted on setting up light shows and actually not really play the game much in the meantime? It's a combo that requires this really big investment and upfront cost that's beyond just like time. Like, a lot of combo decks just need time and they focus on survivability until they draw into their combo. This doesn't really get to do that. This has to spend its time and energy setting everything up, and it's got a little survivability bundled into it because the light show can clear minions, but not very effective or efficient survivability, I would say. So I really do worry about getting this online. Against slower, greedier decks, it's certainly going to feel possible because they're just not pressuring you enough. But against anybody that can do pressure, they can throw minions down, I worry the light show is going to feel very, very awkward in those scenarios. So a card with a really high power output ceiling, it can do crazy things. I just worry the consistency is going to cap this one in regards to its impact on the meta. In other words, I don't think this can be a tier 1 deck. It feels like it's going to be a more, you know, tier 3 range deck that's interesting, that people love playing, that's really fun. You know, it has a little impact on the meta, but it's kind of held in check by faster aggro decks for the most part. Cards or some kind of fun meme thing. If you're playing for meme decks, this is a fun way to get extra copies of stuff that otherwise wouldn't be possible. And of course, you can kind of control that to some extent as well, running a limited number of spells to make sure that this is hitting the targets that you want. And I actually think that's valuable. I think this is probably good outside of a light show deck. Some decks are just going to care about creating extra copies of those awesome play around centerpiece sort of cards. And Rewind will play rather nicely to that. You're going to be willing to pay a little extra in some Mage decks to get the exact right thing, so Rewind will make tons of sense. Audio Splitter here is a new 3-mana 4/3 mech. With Death Rattle, copy the highest cost spell in your hand. So this could be a card for something like a big spell Mage deck where you just got to play stuff out early. And hey, I want extra copies of awesome big spells for, you know, my Millhouse. And then Millhouse will have extra awesome big spells that go to 0 and then 1 mana and so on. So this could be used in that sort of deck. I think this could also be used in a light show deck though. If light shows are your most expensive spells perhaps, then this could just be an extra way to get more light shows and get that train moving. And it is true, the faster you get the light show train moving, the more efficient each of these becomes. You know, where's the breakpoint where light show feels like a really good play for 3 mana? I don't think it's after 1 light show, you know, or the second. I don't think it's the second light show that feels good. Third one though, maybe starts to feel pretty good. 4th and 5th, so on, start to feel really good. So if you can get it going fast enough without losing too much along the way, it's possible that it feels good. But, you know, again, this is not a hyper efficient tempo play or anything. You're just kind of plopping down a pretty basic minion here in hopes to set up for later, which still makes me nervous. I'm a little bit more intrigued by this as that value generator in a big spell Mage deck instead. I think that's a little more interesting than the light show angle. So some possibilities for this card nonetheless. So next up here we have Volume Up, a new 4-mana arcane spell. This one's going to draw you 3 spells. Keep in mind that is targeted draw there, so tutoring some spells out of your deck could be really valuable. If you're looking for light shows specifically, this could be a way to get you to them faster. And then if you proc the finale on this, you also get to discover a copy of one. So extra stuff, extra card for Romath potentially, and in total, this is kind of like a 4-mana draw 4, and arguably a draw mana for draw 4 for 4 mana with upside, because that copy is something you wouldn't otherwise normally have access to, but it's still like getting an extra card from your deck. So really efficient card draw in effect. 4 mana draw 4 is nice, and I can see a few different ways to use that. Of course, if you're just playing in a grindier, slower deck, this is just a great way to grab some resources. You're hoping to get to the late game, so you have spare mana to spend. I could also see this as ways like finding burn damage, just toss this in a slightly more aggressive deck, a faster deck, and just draw into all your burn spells right away and use that as a finisher turn or 2 down the line. So this just looks like a lot of card draw packed into one card, and I think that makes it look pretty good. And then finally here we have the Keyboard Soloist, a 4-mana 2/4 Naga. Battlecry, if you control no other minions, summon 2 1/2 amps with spell damage +1. So 3 bodies across the board here, and some nice spell damage setup, basically spell damage +2 in total, which is a spot we've seen for 4 mana in quite a few cases. And you know, I actually like this card pretty well. I think this one's intriguing. A lot of these like spell damage cards, you have to wait until the turn you play it to get anything exciting out of it, and it's just like kind of sitting there in hand dead, or it's hard to play preemptively. I kind of think the Keyboard Soloist shakes that trend a little bit, because I think sometimes if you play this on 4, you're not altogether sad. It's like, okay, I'm just getting some bodies down, man. Just weave this into an aggressive deck with some early game bodies on board, and you potentially net this benefit of spell damage upside. If you have, you know, some frozen touches or something in hand as burn damage in your aggro deck, okay, you get to benefit from spell damage very occasionally on this, but maybe you're not really sacrificing much as far as like playing minions out too. I mean, these aren't the most aggressive minions, obviously, but when you start to bundle multiple bodies as an upside together with spell damage as well, and these are even mechs, is there some mech synergy there to explore too? I don't know, man, this looks kind of intriguing to me. So like sometimes, yes, it's a late game dump for like a combo finisher, and maybe that's with your light shows or whatever other cards you want. We got the arcane touches now, etc. So it could serve that 4 mana spell damage card slot. but it's got like extra utility or flexibility where sometimes maybe you just play it and hope an amplifier sticks, or hope some, you know, little chip damage sticks off these minions. In other words, it's got extra utility and flexibility merged into one, which I think makes it kind of intriguing. I'm sort of high on this card, although I don't think I've seen a lot of people who are. Rockmaster Voon is a 2-star card. Razorfin Rockstar is a 4-star card. Roaring Applause is a 4-star card. Power Slider is a 2-star card. Drum Soloist is a 2-star card. Love Everlasting is a 5-star card. Shadow Chord Distort is a 3-star card. Fight Over Me is a 2-star card. Light Show is a 3-star card. Rewind is a 4-star card. Audio Splitter is a 3-star card. Volume Up is a 4-star card. Keyboard Soloist is a 3-star card. Well, there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this review. What do you think about Warrior? Is it good? Am I underrating these? Is this what Warrior needed to be saved? I want to hear all those thoughts and more in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.